Salutations everybody, it is Matty here today, sitting down for my review of Forspoken. A big shout out to Square Enix for the review copy about a week ahead of launch. Now I know there's been a lot of uncertainty heading into the release of Forspoken, which is coming out tomorrow, January 24th on PlayStation 5 and PC, $70, $60 respectively. I know that a lot of people are wondering why certain YouTubers didn't get review codes, why certain major gaming outlets like Video Games Chronicle didn't get review codes, but somehow someone like myself ended up with one. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe Square Enix did the talent analysis and said, Mr. Matty looks like a softie, give him a code, he'll give us a passing score. You about to learn today, Square. You about to learn today. Because, ladies and gentlemen, that uncertainty really spawned with the initial reveal of Forspoken, known as originally Project Athia. You see, Forspoken's trailers had this Marvel-style writing that was on steroids. And I say that as someone who is a pretty big Marvel fan. And then as the demo released, and many recognized the gameplay on all fronts didn't feel quite right, that uncertainty ramped up and was only solidified with the PC specs as well as the weird 90 gigabyte file that's available on PS5. I mean, this game is just poorly optimized and you can tell. Now keep in mind, I played this on the PlayStation 5. A PC code was not made available to me. And again, taking a look at those specs, that distinction is incredibly important because based off what I saw, I mean, look at this city, for example. Does this look like you absolutely need a 3070 to run? I would say not. So I'm sure it all speaks for itself to say this. Forspoken is exactly what you feared. It's exactly what I feared. Forspoken from top to bottom as I played it through within 30 hours, all of those fears I had about the game materialized before my very eyes. From the cringe-inducing storytelling that makes you go, who wrote this?
Did I just do that?
Well, definitely with my assistance.
I did not just do that.
We did.
I just moved shit with my mind.
And then you see great names like Gary Whitta and Amy Hennig behind some of that storytelling and original concepting of the game, all the way down to the gameplay, which looks fantastic, but when you play it, it feels like it's been put together with Scotch tape. And then you have arguably one of my most disliked protagonists in a video game in a long, long while, and Forspoken is not very good. But what I can say positively about Forspoken is there's an undeniable weird factor here. From the open world activities to the banter between Frey and Cuff, this game is weird. I don't mind weird ever, and quite frankly, different doesn't mean better because what is there is not executed well. But make no mistake that I haven't fooled myself that absolutely everyone will dislike this game. There is a weird factor there, and sometimes different and weird is all people need to love something. I'm going to break down why that still didn't work for me, but I wanted to make sure that for those of you who want to keep an open mind about this, that there may be something here you end up digging as I'm going through it all. But let's not delay any further. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are new here, you're into video game day one reviews, you're in the right place. We have plenty on the way here and on Retro Rebound, so stay subscribed to both my platforms. Let's start off with that story, because man, oh man, do I have a lot to say about it, and I'm sure you're very curious given the trailers like, oh, did I move that with my mind? Oh, it's all over the place, man. If you could pick one game out and say, they watched the latest Marvel TV show, they watched She-Hulk, or they watched Captain America and went, yeah, okay, I like that. Let's do that. That is what this game's interactions and banter are exactly like. But let's start off at the top. You play as Frey Holland. Now, Frey Holland comes from New York City, and this is where I think the weird factor will kick in a little bit. When I started the game and I saw New York City, I went, as a New York local, that's awesome. I love when I see New York City in a video game, and I'm starting here, but I know I'm going to end up in this fantastical world. So initially, I'm gripped right away. I go, okay, let's see, how do we get there? And immediately, the weirdness kicks up to a notch I just can't explain away, as Frey's harassed by a local gang, and she takes an hour getting away from an enemy that has a gun, and then she gives them the double bird, and I go, oh brother, it's gonna be one of those games. But look, I can deal with that type of cringiness, if you will, because to me, that can make the game kind of fun. But as it digs its heels into that nature more and more, and you have this miserable protagonist in the middle of it all, I couldn't help but sit there and go, wow, I will never forget this experience for all of the worst reasons. So as Frey is stuck in New York City. She needs to find a way out. She wants to strike back at these gangs. She ends up finding what's called Cuff, pretty much the golden thing that's going to be on her arm and gives her all the powers. This opens up a portal to where the game is set, being Athia, this mythical fantasy land that's going as far as the eye can see. Eventually you're doing magic parkour, and the game starts to take on an identity of its own. You can say a lot of things about Forspoken, but there's not many things like it, and again, that's why I think some people may gravitate towards it. But I'll get into the execution of all those elements later on in the video. For now, we'll stick with the story. Forspoken is like the nagging sibling that keeps wrestling away the controller from you in its opening hours. It's my turn, as they stop you again for another cutscene as you can't play the game again. For all that Forspoken can ever do right, which is very little in my eyes, the biggest wrong it has as an action RPG is taking away control from you endlessly. And it's funny because I don't mind if they're soaking up all this time to deliver a great story, but all of the script time is soaked up on BSing and Frey honestly just being a god-awful person instead of spending time building its world. The world of Athia is actually interesting, but all that learning you're going to do about Athia is through text logs in the game. If you don't pay attention to those, quite frankly, you'll be lost in the story. But keep in mind that Forspoken is not a bad story because it's hard to follow or because it's confusing. Quite the opposite. It's so straightforward and predictable with how the character arc for Frey is going to go and who she ends up being and what her connections are to the world of Athia. You just see it all coming. It's horribly predictable, and that comes from someone who, I'll call myself out, I'm terrible at predicting how games are going to go. As much as I play them, I'm just always there for the ride and just seeing where it'll take me. But this one, from start to beginning, I was like, this is going to happen. Got it. Boom. Okay. Like, there is no surprises tucked away here. And so all that script time that's soaked up are for moments like this.
Destruction and corruption are forms of creation in themselves.
Wow, you sound like a serial killer.
What?
Destruction and corruption are beautiful forms of creation in themselves.
I don't sound like that.
You absolutely sound like that.
I know you absolutely sound like that. Yeah, see? Two can play at that game.
You're fucking stupid.
Or there are moments like this that take up script time.
What is happening?
I'm not sure.
Whoa. I think he just leveled up.
Instead of getting rid of these awe-inspiringly cringy one-liners, and I use cringe lightly as someone who does a lot of writing themselves. I know how sensitive people can be to those types of things, but that is honestly the best word to use to critique the writing in this game. The, whoa, I just leveled up. The call-outs to obvious things happening on screen as if there is no visual before us. It's clear this script was written, hardly edited as far as I'm concerned, and just kind of thrown out there because they're talking about things that the player's clearly seeing. Like, for example, Frey doesn't need to say, whoa, I just leveled up when she gets a new power. You see that with your own eyes. You don't need to write that out. So it's just wasted script time, and that's all this game is, where it can spend time developing her into an interesting character. I don't mind if she starts off rugged and detached, as she clearly is, but over the course of the game, it's not the actress's fault. She's just following the script, and technically, I guess she does a good job. And even though it's by design, she's just miserable to be around. I've never disliked a protagonist more. Because when she gets to Athia, she now suddenly wants to go back to New York City, where she was homeless and gave away her cat to the judge, who decided to wipe away a mark on her criminal record just because. And so now the people of Athia are calling her a hero, while others are calling her a demon. So now she's motivated to strike back at some of these protectors of the land. And yes, the dialogue count really isn't my problem, by the way. I mean, look at the shirt I'm wearing. Hello, Naruto. Filler anime here. I love Naruto, by the way, but filler anime, a lot of it. I'm a huge Trails fan. Trails has hour stretches of just no gameplay, all dialogue. I got the patience of a saint when it comes to these video games. When it comes to all entertainment, I am ready to sit down and have a great story told to me and watch that developer's vision come to fruition. So do not mark any of my complaints as impatience, because you're talking to probably the person the game was made for. But there is so much of it that they even have a mechanic tied to it where you can stop and talk to Cuff and pick what you want to talk with him about. Oh, and on top of that, there's so much dialogue constantly happening over every little thing across this game. You don't get a moment of peace, mind you. And then, on top of all of that, is that the game cuts itself off because there's so much dialogue that I've just interrupted dialogue by stepping into cutscenes by accident. I'm like, holy smokes, no one shuts up in this game. It's insane. And again, you're talking to the right guy. I am so for this type of energy, but it's so constant. The game is just shutting off its own dialogue because it's never ending. It's unreal how much they poured into it. And especially because they failed to execute on the narrative vision here as far as I'm concerned, because by the end of the game, I'm just like, okay, so we learned very little about this world unless I read those text logs. Why wasn't that text log stuff intelligently incorporated into the overall script? It just... That's enough about the story, though. I could quite frankly beat up on it all day, but as I'm sure you could tell, dating back to, say, my Saints Row review or my Gotham Knights review, I am so tired of these AAA games being written, like, on complete amateur level. It's insane to me that we keep seeing stories like this out of AAA gaming. But I digress. Gameplay is where AAA gaming can truly thrive. They got the most money to throw at the resources. And yes, the magic parkour in this game does feel great. So as you flow over one object to the next, traversing is great. Even if I kind of have an issue with the fact that they have a stamina meter here, I would love just to be able to flow wherever I want, when I want. But unfortunately, you're limited, and you can increase that stamina amount over time by completing main story and side objectives, but still, it feels great to go from point A to point B. But this is where it starts to feel a bit like it was put together with Scotch tape. Now, as I said, I played on PlayStation 5. When you want to activate magic parkour, you have to hold the circle button. So what happens when you're trying to magic parkour in necessary parts of the combat, you can no longer have your right thumb on the right thumbstick to rotate the camera. So if you want to magic parkour away and see what's going on, you cannot rotate that camera. It's moments like that where you feel a hiccup in the overall design of the game. Anyone who tested this game would be like, why am I able to sprint and get around with my left thumbstick, but when I want to do the main movement mechanic of the game, I can no longer control the camera with my right thumbstick? I wouldn't mind this if it wasn't so necessary in combat, and there is a lock-on camera system, but the game typically throws at you a lot of enemies, so you will need to manipulate your camera. And unless you're familiar with the claw grip on a controller, you're going to have a tough time navigating. Still, the open world here is staggering, and when you're going to all these activities is where I think Forspoken has its best sense of identity. There's a lack of HUD as you just flow over one object to the next, going to your newest activity. And some of these activities are really fun, like for example, clearing out a fort. Now, as you use magic parkour, some of those dodges I mentioned can actually chain into attacks. But this is where, again, the Scotch tape example comes up again. So there is a pseudo infamous feel here. If I were to say like poor man's Infamous, that might be being a little bit harsh, but pretty much it begins with that same style. You have powers mapped to certain triggers, and you're kind of just doing a third-person shooter that feels pretty bad for the opening 5-6 hours of the game. Then you're going to start to get new magic abilities, and you can swap sets whenever you want. And there are so many spells in this game, well over 100, and it's pretty cool when you start to get to build your own kit and what you want to use. And as you're swapping sets of magic, you're going to be able to target enemy weaknesses, like say their wings or their head, and certain elements and parts are weak to different setups for your fray, which again is pretty nice to have. But this combat just doesn't feel good. When it's mapped to the right trigger, it makes use of the haptic feedback and adaptive triggers. Even when you're running around, you feel like a light vibration with every step. And so there's a flow, a rhythm to it almost. But when you're in combat, it's a lot of pop in, pop out style combat where you can't really stay in the thick of it for too long, which the game's design practically begs you to, especially when you unlock things like the chain whip that you can pull yourself into combat. It just almost feels like a slightly evolved version of Final Fantasy 15, which makes sense because Luminous Productions is behind this game, and Luminous, some of those teammates headed up Final Fantasy 15. So it makes sense why you'd feel some of that inspiration in this game. But here's the brutal reality as someone who was a big Final Fantasy 15 defender for some time until I eventually bend the knee. The combat there isn't that great, and you can feel elements of it here where it auto fights as you just kind of tap the right trigger and then dodge and then tap the right trigger and then dodge. And it becomes rinse and repeat, pop in, pop out combat. And the problem with that is the enemy design never encourages you to do anything different. So the game gets boring really quickly. For example, the first truly major boss in the game that delivers you your first set of new powers has the same attack palette as one of the mini bosses in the game. And while there is a subtle difference that is deeper in a third phase of that boss fight, it does not matter to me because most of the attacks that you saw from that one boss were seen earlier in the game. I don't mind when games reuse assets. That's the name of the game in game development, especially when we're talking about how expensive it's becoming. So I have no problem with it, but you can't make it this egregious and this obvious. It's frustrating and it makes the boss fight lose all sense of tension. I'm like, oh, it's this attack pattern, the one I've been dodging for the first like 3 hours of the game. Okay, like this is gonna be rinse and repeat, and I absolutely waxed her. Perhaps the cardinal sin, though, is that throughout all these encounters, have you noticed I really haven't mentioned any clever usage of the magic parkour? I talked about the feeling of going point A to point B being good, but have you recognized that I said it's only annoying to use in combat? That's because this game barely makes use of it in combat. The opportunities here, based off the systems that exist, are so blatantly not capitalized upon. I don't know what they were thinking when they were making it. What I mean by that is, for example, you can naturally flow over objects when you're doing magic parkour in this game. Why very little boss fights used a sense of verticality for you to climb up objects or to leap between certain objects, I don't know why it was scarcely used. Don't get me wrong, there are some that do that, but it's so infrequently used and capitalized upon, it's just a mechanic to get you from point A to point B when it could be so much more. And this is why I said the weird factor to me cannot overcome the lack of execution here. The combat and systems here that exist are great, but the way they're connected and interweave, it feels like they're put together with Scotch tape. It's just not intelligent design. And then when you get into the magic parkour, the defining element of the game, it's practically useless in the main thing that you're doing in the game. Take, for example, the locked labyrinth, one of the open world activities you can participate in. It is literally a straight corridor into a square room, into a straight corridor, into a square room, and then you finally fight a boss in an enormous room, and then it's over. It makes no use of its own mechanics. You can tell this game was just eventually slapped together. Not because it's laziness, but because they probably didn't have time to maximize the potential of these mechanics. And that's frustrating because it just feels very middling the entire time. So that's why I say the activities themselves, like going to a fort and fighting enemies, is kind of unique. It's fun to just go and clear out enemies, but when you start to get into the actual act of combat, you start to feel like, this feels like crap, man. Like I can't enjoy myself here. There's no flow, no rhythm, no anything here. I'm just feeling very stuck and rigid despite what looks to be flippy fun combat. And I think that all goes back to the control scheme. For example, having two magic systems equipped at the same time would have been a great thing to have in the early going of the game. For most of the game, you're spent just kind of peppering enemies with rocks kind of like this. And then eventually you get this fire sword. And I'm like, what if I could use the fire sword and the peppering of the rocks at the same time? But it just maps them to one set at a single time. When I'm like, why don't I use the square button for the sword? And then I use the shooty shoot for my right trigger, and then the left trigger is another ability. Like it just speaks for itself, but it never takes advantage of it. It just blows my mind because all the tools are there to make something that could have overcome the odds beautifully, but it just never does. There are monuments that you can do that are effectively challenges on the maps. You'll find little houses throughout the open world that are fast travel points where you can stop and craft. There's a ton of crafting in this game. You can upgrade your equipment with little effects you'll unlock through completing all forms of activities. You'll also be able to create, say, healing potions or increase the amount of potions that you can carry with you. There will also be challenges that you could take on as you level up because this game does have a pretty interesting leveling system. So as you're exploring the world, you might find these little white pockets of magic called mana, and you'll be actually using this mana to level up your spells. On top of that, you can equip nails, which have all different types of effects. And as you complete these challenges, it'll upgrade these spells. So there actually are some pretty decent RPG elements here. And I did have fun when I went into the menu and unlocked a new set of powers, really toying around with what was there. Especially given that there are so many options, we'll all have different builds. This is a game's strength. There are also things called detours, which are side quests. If you ever need to kind of check the temperature on these, the first one they show you is what's called a city tour, where you run around, talk to 5 NPCs, then run around and feed some sheep, and then run around and talk to a couple people. I'm just like, what? Man, what are we doing here? What's going on? What is happening? What am I doing? I had an existential crisis, right? And you know, based off Saints Row, when Matty has an existential crisis during a game, that's when we know we got something pretty poor on our hands. So from top to bottom, the story, the gameplay, the execution really is all flawed. But the execution is really, as you can tell, what I honed in on here throughout this review. Because there's a lot of elements that I could see working out for Forspoken in the long term. But you can't patch that writing, you can't patch those awe-inspiringly bad cutscenes, and you can't patch that they didn't really design the levels intelligently enough to make use of the mechanics, or that the control scheme doesn't really support the actual mechanics in-game. There's just so many problems with it that could have been easily remedied, and that's what makes it the most frustrating. Forspoken does have a lot of potential, and some people, I have no doubt, will comment on this video and go, well, I'm gonna like it anyway, this looks pretty good. To that I say, all the more power to you, enjoy. For me, this game's a skip. With so many games coming out in 2023, you don't need to waste your time on Forspoken, hoping it comes around, hoping that it's a little hidden gem. There are certified bangers dropping in 2023. You don't need to spend a ton of time on this one. It is a game that, by the way, I finished the story remarkably quick, even though they said, I think 35 to 40 hours. A lot of my extra time was just spent in the open world because I breezed through the 12-chapter story. But I digress. That is all I have to say about Forspoken. It is a game that is exactly what I feared, and I think you should just go spend your money elsewhere. If you want to pick it up on a sale, like a deep sale, see if it's for you at like $10, sure. But just some of those things I talked about, whether it be control scheme or story writing, isn't going to be fixed no matter how many updates come to the game. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hand it off to you. What do you think about Forspoken? Fire away in the comments down below. I'm looking forward to seeing your thoughts. Other than that, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram. Those links are in the description down below. And a big thank you to all the patrons, all the members who continue to support the hell out of the content here. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.